How do you sum up a book like Genesis? We spent over a year in this book, 50 chapters. This book, I mentioned in the very beginning, this is my favorite book in all of Scripture. Everything to follow is contained in here in one way or another. And it's just absolutely incredible. From the very creation of the world, the beginning of time as we know it, is covered all the way through until we go through the lives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And after this chapter, we begin to follow not the lives of individuals, but the plight of the nation of Israel throughout pretty much the rest of Scripture. So this morning, I wanted to spend some time looking at some of these things, and there's so much stuff in here. I just want to really jump right in and look at chapter 50, the end. I figured the best way to end it is the way that God chose. Chapter 50. The first 3 verses here. This is what Moses writes. Then Joseph fell on his father's face. His father had died. Wept over him and kissed him. Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. Now 40 days were required for it, for such is the period required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. Beginning of this chapter, to me, the first thing we see again is the humanity of the people in Scripture. And we come to the painful truth that there's real pain in death. I know so often people say, as believers, we have a great hope. It's absolutely true. We have the hope of the resurrection. We have the assurance of being brought back to life because of our faith in Jesus, a promise that He has made. But we don't often talk about the pain of death. And it's real. There's real heartfelt pain. We don't suffer the same way as those who have no hope, but there's still pain and loss and loneliness. And we see this in this chapter. October 22nd this year will be 20 years since my father died during an operation. I can still recall every second of it. I was at the hospital with my mother, my two sisters, one of my brothers. When the doctor, I will make this a very short story, was avoiding my mother, and finally we confronted him in the hall, my mother and I, and the doctor told my mother that my father had died. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, but most of the time if there's a chaplain around, they send a chaplain. This chaplain was a young woman who's probably half my age, and my mother literally broke down in the hallway, and my sisters. And my brother and I were going to, but somebody had to keep something together. And the chaplain came over to me, and she said, was this unexpected? And I said to her, every time somebody dies, it's unexpected. I don't care if you know, I don't care how long it's in coming. When the person actually passes from life to death, you're not ready. It's just not expected thing. And I told her that, and we see that here with Joseph. The reason that Joseph was with his father Jacob is because Jacob was dying, and that's why Joseph went there. That's why he brought his children to be blessed by him. He was in his father's presence, and yet what happens when he dies, it says, Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. It was a painful separation. Joseph knew the faith of his father. He knew his own faith. It still was a very painful time for him. It hurt. And then it says that Joseph asked the physicians in Egypt to embalm his father. Now there are two groups of people who would embalm someone when they died. One was the priests in Egypt. The other were the physicians. At that time in Egypt, it was very much like we have today. Each Egyptian doctor had a specialty. That's why it says Joseph asked the physicians. There was a multitude of people that were kind of responsible to Joseph. Each one treated a different disease. Joseph called the physicians to embalm his father because he did not want the priests involved in it. When the priest embalmed somebody, they would put amulets in there and do all kinds of pagan hocus pocus and whatever else. And Joseph didn't want that associated with his father, so he called his physicians. It was an involved process. It says here in Scripture it took 40 days. I did research, I read about it, just because I was interested about it. One of the most interesting facts to me was that in the embalming, the physicians would take a hook and put it up the person's nose to pull their brains out through the nose. I found that very interesting, and it just reminded me of a Far Side cartoon. Somebody, hey, there's nothing up there. But it was a process, a 40-day process, and during this time, they embalmed Jacob. They got him ready to travel, and we see in 4-6, Moses writes this: "When the days of mourning for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, 'If I have now found favor in your sight, please speak to Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, behold, I'm about to die. In my grave, which I dug for myself in the land of Canaan, there you shall bury me. Now therefore, please let me go up and bury my father, and I will return.' And Pharaoh said, 'Go up and bury your father as he made you swear.'" So Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, not to Pharaoh directly. There's several different theories on that, but I think the most obvious, the one that makes the most sense, is that Joseph would not be allowed in the presence of Pharaoh when he was mourning. Remember, Pharaoh was considered to be a god in Egypt. And in the ancient Middle East, Near East, Far East, you did not approach the king or the leader with any kind of sadness or sorrow. You had to be properly presented. You had to have a smile on your face. And because Joseph was mourning, he probably wasn't dressed properly. He probably didn't shave. If you remember when Joseph was in jail and he had interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. Yeah, good. Thank you. Just want to see if you're paying attention. The baker and the cupbearer, and word got to Pharaoh when he had his dream, and he found out Joseph could interpret dreams. And it says in 41, when Pharaoh found out, then he sent and called for Joseph. They hurriedly brought him out of the dungeon, right? Because Pharaoh wanted him right away. What happened? Then he shaved himself and changed his clothes and came to Pharaoh. He couldn't go to Pharaoh the way he was. He had to be cleaned up. And Joseph, technically wasn't cleaned up and had to come before him. So he got ready. He sent to Pharaoh's house. He asked about his father, and he said, listen, my father made me promise that I would bury him in Canaan, in his grave. And Pharaoh said, swear, means promise. He said, go and do what you promised. There's a comment from Warren Wiersbe about this, and I thought this was interesting. He said, we plan for our vacation, we plan for our retirement, but we don't plan for our death. And that's really true. I'm sure there's not a person in this room that has not had someone in your family or in some way, shape, or form that you were involved with funeral arrangements for somebody. Most of the time, it's pretty much unplanned. Most of the time, you kind of, that's one of the great things about having siblings. You can all get together and talk about, what do you think this, Dad would want? Well, we think this, that, and this. There's no second guessing or whatever. We all thought about what he would want. But if it was written out, if it was told, just like Jacob here, he said, listen, I want you to bury me in this place. When my great Aunt Jenny died, she had very explicit instructions for her funeral. She had the music picked out. She named the pallbearers. She even had the colored ties that she wanted the men to wear at the funeral. And it was great. Not the fact that we missed her. It was great that she had everything done. We didn't have to second guess. We didn't worry. Said, what are we supposed to do? Here's the instructions. And it made me think about it. I think that's a good idea. To give some thought to it, have some idea. It makes it so much easier for the people who are planning, following. I haven't done this yet, but Sharon told me that when I die, she was going to rip out all the plants in the yard because she doesn't want to take care of them. So even though I haven't given funeral instruction, I have ripped out most of the plants in the yard. So I feel in a way I'm preparing to make the transition easier. But Jacob gave very explicit instructions to his sons. I want to be buried in the land that God promised us. And Joseph asked Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, yes, do what you're supposed to do. And then it says in 7-11, so Joseph went up to bury his father. And with him went all the servants of Pharaoh's, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, all the household of Joseph, and his brothers, and his father's household. They left only their little ones, their flocks, their herds in the land of Goshen. There also went up with him both chariots and horsemen, and it was a very great company. And when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and sorrowful lamentation. And he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. Now when the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning for the Egyptians." Therefore it was named Abel Mitzrayim, which is beyond the Jordan. Look at the company that Moses describes that went up for Jacob. It shows how much people respected Joseph in the land of Egypt. Servants, all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the household, all the elders of Egypt, the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household, chariots, horsemen, a great company. They all went with Joseph to go and bury his father. What an incredible thing. And it was something that the people in the land of Canaan had never seen. They saw this thing that, wow, and they assumed it was a grieving of the Egyptians, which is really incredible. It was something that was noticed in the land. Two notes about this little section. First, in verse 10 it says, Joseph observed 7 days of mourning. It's not only mentioned here, but in one or two other places, but many people believe that this is the basis for the custom of sitting Shiva. Shiva means 7. When a person dies, a Jewish person dies, there's a Shiva. You go to the person's home for 7 days, and you sit with the family, and you bring food, and you talk about the person, you tell stories, and you share your grief. But many people believe that this is a basis for that custom, and I think that's true. See, the Egyptians mourned for 70 days. Joseph mourned for 7 days. So he not only mourned in the land of Egypt, he mourned personally at the grave with his family, because it was only his sons that went with him. His brothers, I mean. And then the other note here is that there's kind of a play on words that Moses uses, and the only reason I'm telling you again is so that you could show off to your friends who don't come here. Abel Mitzrayim, it means field of the Egyptians. But people also called it Ebel, which means mourning. So it technically could be the field of the Egyptians or the mourning of the Egyptians. Either way is a valid interpretation here. But it shows that the people saw this great sorrow of the nation of Egypt shown to Jacob. In 12 to 14, we see like the personal story and the personal burial. We go from the nation kind of to personal. Thus his sons did for him as he charged them. They followed his instructions. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field for a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers, and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So we see that it was the brothers, the sons of Jacob, who had to promise to bring the body back and buried it. They had the great national mourning, but they themselves went onto the grave personally and buried Jacob, and they stayed at the grave for 7 years. Again, a comment from Warren Wiersbe, because I thought it was very pertinent. We, in our society, don't often talk about death and mourning and life, and we often too have, I remember the number, 7 stages of grief or more, whatever the heck it is, I don't know. The older I get, the less, I'm not saying that's not a credible thing, but mourning is such a personal thing. It really is. There's no timetable. You can't put a timetable on there. You can't measure the pain. But there comes a time, and Wiersbe talks about this. I'm going to read a few sentences from him. When a person needs to move on in some way. This is what Wiersbe says. When death invades a family, and you've done all you can to honor the deceased and comfort the sorrowing, There comes a time when you have to return to life and its duties. This doesn't mean we forget the deceased, but it does mean that we put our grief into perspective and get back to the business of living. Prolonged mourning may bring us more sympathy, but it won't develop more maturity or make us more useful to others. Joseph and his family returned to Egypt and went back to work, Joseph serving in Pharaoh's court and his brother caring for Pharaoh's cattle. I don't mean to say that in a callous way, because if you know anything about Warren Wiersbe, that's the last thing in the world you would accuse him of. But what he says is that eventually you need to return back to life. And again, I don't think there's a timetable for that. I don't think it's an easy transition, but it's something that needs to be done. It does not mean, as he said, that you don't continue to honor the deceased. It's not that they're in their memory. We saw a couple chapters before that Jacob speaks about the death of Rachel and his great sorrow from 50 years before. 50 years before, there's still a real pain. But there has to be some kind of return to life, a return to responsibilities. And that's what he mentions here. After he buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, he and his brothers. Joseph went back to being in Pharaoh's court. His brothers went back to watching the cattle. Certainly, they helped one another. They watched over one another. But I think that's one of the things that we help a person that's mourning, is we give them space and time and be with them and honor their pain that they're suffering. And it's something, as I mentioned last week, my brother-in-law said, you never get over the pain, you just learn to deal with it. And I think that's kind of what's being said here. A very difficult time, but again, I think we see all the humanity in Scripture. These people were real people. They dealt with difficult situations and problems. 15 to 21, it talks about the brothers of Joseph. This is what happens when they get back to the land. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong we did to him?" So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged us before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.' But Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones.' So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." There is a question, many commentators, about whether Jacob actually said this or not. Did Jacob actually tell the brothers to go to Joseph afterwards and say, "Hey, don't hold this against these guys. You know, you need to forgive them. Remember that." Or did the brothers make it up? So there's two schools of thought. One school says yes, and one school says no. Well, I'll leave it at that. I think the fact that the brothers were afraid that Joseph would take revenge on them says a lot more about the brothers than it does about Joseph and Jacob. They had this fear still. And either way, when we see them go to him, Joseph's response is to cry. And it's a stronger word than cry, it's to weep. There's a difference between crying and weeping. Joseph is hurt to the core that his brothers would think this about him. It says he just begins to weep. And he says to them, this is incredible to me, "Don't be afraid. Am I in God's place?" In other words, who am I, God? Am I the one that punishes and judges? And this just is incredible to me. You think about the life of Joseph that he had, and at the end his brothers come to me and say, hey, listen, who am I, God? You know, I'm not God. I'm a servant of God. And, you know, the thing that amazes me about this really is it made me think about how many times I put myself in the place of God. I couldn't say that in this situation. There's a lot of times when things happen to me, and I'm thinking, you know, maybe I'm not God, but I'll give you a judgment here for sure. You know, sure, I'll take God's place. You know, move over to the throne, let me get up there, and I'll take care of this in 2 seconds. But it's not what Joseph says. He said, who am I, God? I'm going to leave this situation totally in God's hands. And then he says, as for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result. Only a true servant of God could make a statement like that. Only a true servant of God. Remember Joseph? His brothers threw him in a pit, no water, out in the sun. You know what it's like to be outside for 5 minutes in the sun. Somebody throws you in a pit in Arizona, that's a bad problem. And not only that, then you hear him having lunch. Man, that's pretty hard. And then they say, you know, let's kill him. I got a better idea. Let's sell him as a slave. They take this kid, who's probably 17, 18 years old, and they sell him to the Midianites. You know, in one day. Next day, he's on his way as a slave, sold, goes down into Egypt. And when he gets down there, he's in the slave auction, and Potiphar buys him. He spends several years in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife accuses him of sexual assault, pretty relevant in our culture today. And what happens? He goes to jail. He spends years in jail, has several false hopes of getting out, finally gets out. Why? It's all because of the actions of his brothers. And he says to them, look, you know, you meant this bad, but God meant it for good. Only a true servant of God could make a statement like that. You know, we throw around the word servant like nothing. You know, yeah, I'm a servant of God. We sing it in our songs. But the reality of being a real servant of God, it's not pleasant a lot of times. You know, Jesus said, the world hates me, they're going to hate you. That's kind of a servant. I promise you in this world you have tribulation. Well, I want to be a servant, but, you know, let's cross this section out and this. I mean, you know, I don't mind getting answered prayer or going to heaven, but, yeah, this hating, I'm out of that part. You know, you'll have trouble in it? I don't want to. You know, you're like a good news servant, like a good time friend, you know? Somebody who's your friend when things are going good, and then when something bad happens, they just dump you. I mean, that's I think, in the back of our mind a lot of time, that's really what servant of God means. But Joseph saw himself as a real servant, and a real servant accepts God's will knowing that God knows best. A real servant accepts God's will without self-pity, without animosity, without anger. But we know that God has designed certain things, and as his servant, we go along with him. That's why Joseph says that. And Joseph is just cut to the quick when his brothers say that. And he's, listen, you know what? I'm God's servant. God used me to help you. I'm happy with that. Imagine that. God used me to help you. And I'm happy that he did that. He says, because God knows best. And then he assures him. And this shows the character of Joseph. He says, listen, I'm going to take care of you and your little ones. I mean, what a spirit this guy had. And it says he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And literally, the phrase in the Hebrew is, he spoke to their hearts. That's what Moses says. And it's the same idea if you talk to a friend of yours or somebody in the family and you have a heart-to-heart talk with them. You know, we use that phrase to show an intimate conversation, a heart-to-heart. That's what Joseph did with his brothers. He had a heart-to-heart conversation with them. And when they were speaking heart-to-heart, he said, listen to me. I bear no animosity towards you. I promise you, I will always take care of you, and I'll take care of your children as well. That's what Joseph tells them in the end. And he did it because he genuinely loved them. That was his character. 22 to 26, it says, now Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household. And Joseph lived to 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the son of Manasseh, who were born on Joseph's knees. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land which he promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. So Joseph died at the age of 110 years old, and he was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So we see Joseph lives to 110 years old. People argue about whether he saw his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren. Either way, he saw several generations. And he says, when he's close to death, that he tells his brothers, God will deliver you. God will keep his promises. His last recorded words were, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. I always wonder what my last words will be. It seems like a lot of pressure. I don't know. How are we going to be at the moment of death when we realize that the time has come and that's the end of our time here? How are we going to be? How are we going to act? What's going to be on our mind? I think about it, and first of all, we don't know if we'll even have that time. You don't know if you're going to have an opportunity to give last words. I hope and I think about encouraging my children to continue to be faithful to God and to follow God. What could be more important? And take care of your mother. I'm assuming I'm going first. Take care of your mother. Those are things that will be most important to me. But Joseph says, God will surely take care of you. God will keep his promises to you. When he does, I don't want to be buried here either. You take my bones with you. Hebrews 11:22, the writer says this, by faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. His last words were words of faith. Joseph, I know God's going to come. He's going to take care of you. Take me with you. I want to go. In Exodus 13:19, Moses writes this, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For he had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones with you from here. He died in faith. He had the coffin set up. It was something that people could look at and remember. I don't know where, I don't think anybody really knows, but the coffin of Joseph with his body inside was stored somewhere in Egypt, and it probably was in the land of Goshen, but certainly the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew where it was because they took it with him. And his coffin, wherever it was stored, was a constant reminder to them that God would take them, God would fulfill his promises to them. And when the time came, I don't know, Moses knew about it. Somebody knew where it was, but they carried his bones with him. And one other observation about this final section, Joseph says twice, God will surely take care of you. And literally in the Hebrew, this is the word visit you. And most of the time, I didn't have time to check out every single instant. Most of the time, the majority of times when it says God will visit you, it talks about a divine intervention between God and people. God will visit, God made a promise, surely he will visit you and fulfill his promise. I'll give you a very clear example of this in Genesis 21. Remember it says when Sarah was pregnant, it says, then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he promised. He said she was going to have a son, even though she was very old, and it says he took note. Some versions say he remembered, but it's that same word used to visit. God visited Sarah. It was a divine intervention again between God and people. And that's what this is. There'll be some divine, I will intervene in a divine manner. We know now that was through the 10 judgments, the 10 plagues, that God intervened in the world and brought his people out. So, incredible end to an incredible book. Gary told me not to take too much time, so I'll be short. Two things about this, okay? First, the people that we meet in this book lived their whole life with God and trusted Him. They were not always perfect, but it was the general direction of their life, because nobody's perfect, nobody's sinless. But all the people we meet in Genesis who loved God generally followed Him. Yeah, they had some big setbacks, but I don't know anybody that hasn't had setbacks. But the general direction was following God with their life. They trusted Him. These two men, Jacob and Joseph, that are mentioned in this chapter, they died in faith. They believed in the promises of God, those God had fulfilled and those that God was going to fulfill. When I was young, came to faith, and Sharon and I went to a church, was a church plant. Pretty much everybody in the church was around our age, like 98% of the people. Because the church grew, people were sharing their faith, and naturally you share faith in your circle. Most people hang around with people generally their age, and that's how the church grew. Several years later, when I went to Moody Bible Institute, I was 30 years old, and when I got there for the first time, really, I met a lot of old people, really old. They were my age now, and most of them were my professors, but it was something unique to me, and it was very important to me that these people who were 60 and 70 and 80 years old had clung to their faith throughout their life, regardless of the challenges of life, the ups and downs, their personal fears and failures. They were committed to God. They loved God. They worshiped God. And that really made a big impact on me, because these people had stood the test of time and still hung in with God. And the same thing we see through these people in the scriptures. We see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob particularly. Not people who are flawless, but people who followed God throughout their life. Very encouraging to me that these people wound up that way. And the second thought, which I have to take as a generalization from the book, is that we see God's love for the Jewish people, and by extension, His love for us. I think that's a very powerful lesson in the book of Genesis. What does God's love to the Jewish people matter to those of us who are not Jewish? What difference does it make? Well, in the book of Romans, chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul waxes eloquently about Israel and the history of Israel, God's call of Israel. But also in chapter 11, he gives the illustration of the olive tree. Talks about the root of the olive tree. It's interpreted in many different ways. The tree is sometimes thought of as the tree of blessing. The roots are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or true faith, the foundation of all that's true faith in the true God. And Paul says that some of the branches were broken off and the wild branches were put in the tree. The wild branches in Paul's story are the Gentiles, people who are not Jewish. He said, and you, although a wild olive branch, were grafted in among the others and now stand in the nourishing root of the olive tree. And what Paul is telling us, and I want you to think about this. From the beginning of time, God was concerned with all people. But He Himself chose Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the Jewish people as His people. He gave special promises to them. He made covenants with them. And the Bible, you read the Bible, it's about the Jewish people and the Jewish nation and God's love for them and God's testimony to them, God's faithfulness to them. And now, because Jesus has lived His life, has given His life, not that it wasn't before, but now it's clearly open to all people of all nations. That's what the book of Revelation says. And in God's grace and mercy, He has chosen the Jewish people as His special love. However, every person who comes to faith in Jesus is now grafted into that tree. we become partakers of the promises that God made. That is beyond belief to me. That's why the picture of God's love for Israel is so important. His faithfulness to them, his love to them, his promises to them, his love despite their failures. That's our God. And we are grafted in. He's faithful to us. His promises are also to us. When we fail and fall back, he's still faithful to us. We see that. And in his mercy, we are grafted in. To me, it's just absolutely incredible. Through faith, we become the children of Abraham. We don't become Jewish. It doesn't say that there's, because you remember in Galatians, Paul says, and this is a very important verse, it says, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, male nor female. You are all one in the Messiah, Jesus. And people so often get on all different kinds of tracks about what this means. The very simple essence of what Paul's point is here is that in Jesus, we stand in equal standing before God. That is amazing to me. It's incredible. It doesn't matter what your station is in life. He says slave or free. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. When we come to faith in Jesus, our sin is placed on him. His righteousness is given to us. And now we stand in equal standing before God. What an incredible, incredible thing. The mercy and grace of God. I think that we don't often think about that. You think about some of the things and the issues that come up in the book of Genesis, especially with the Jewish people. We talked about God's faithfulness to them, and the land of Israel came up over and over and over again. The exact same issues that we deal with today. Exact same issues. But we know that God is faithful. We know that God will do what he says. We see God's great love for his people Israel, his care, his concern, his keeping of his promises, and we can be sure that this God has the same love for those of us who came to faith in Messiah, that we now are his children, that we are grafted in to that tree. Incredible. I think it's absolutely unbelievable, the grace and mercy. That's what Paul talks about at the end of Romans 11. Oh, the mysteries, the wonder, the grace, the majesty of God. That's the God who loves us. That's the God that we serve. Let's pray.